What happens when one of Hollywood's most controlled, image-perfect stars walks onto a stage built for interruption, debate, and quiet provocation, and finally decides he's had enough? The studio lights were already hot before Brad Pitt took his seat, but no one could have predicted just how quickly the temperature would rise. The applause was polite at first, the kind that rolls in like a practiced wave, enthusiastic but contained. Brad smiled, that familiar half-smile that had sold decades of red carpets and late-night interviews, and nodded toward the audience as he adjusted himself into the chair. On the surface, it looked like any other appearance. Another promotional stop. Another carefully managed conversation. But something in his posture gave it away. His shoulders were tighter than usual. His jaw didn't relax even when he laughed. And when Sunny Hostin leaned forward, cue cards resting lightly in her hands, her expression sharp but calm, there was a flicker, brief, almost invisible, that crossed Brad's eyes. A warning, maybe. Or exhaustion. Before we go any further, if you're already feeling that tension in the air, make sure you subscribe to the narration show. Stories like this don't just unfold, they explode. Like this video, drop a comment, and stay with us because what happened next wasn't scripted, rehearsed, or easily forgotten. Sunny began the interview the way she always did, warm, precise, disarming. She congratulated Brad on his latest film, praised his performance, mentioned the critical acclaim. He nodded, thanked her, even laughed lightly when she teased him about disappearing into roles. The audience relaxed. So did the other hosts. This was safe territory. Until it wasn't. So Brad, Sunny said, her voice still smooth, your career has spanned decades, but in recent years, the public conversation around you has shifted. People are asking different questions now, about accountability, about growth, about the stories we tell versus the ones we live. Brad's smile held, but something behind it hardened. I think that comes with age, he replied carefully. You get quieter. You listen more. Sunny tilted her head just slightly. Listening is important, she said. But so is responding. There it was. The first ripple. Brad glanced at her, then away, as if choosing his words from a shelf he'd already dusted 1,000 times. I've responded where it mattered, he said. Privately. Sunny didn't blink. But when you're a public figure, she countered, privacy and accountability often collide. The audience shifted. You could hear it. The subtle rustle of discomfort, the kind that precedes something going off script. Brad leaned back, crossed one ankle over the other. I'm not here to litigate my life, he said, still calm, but his voice had lost its softness. I'm here to talk about the work. Sunny's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, but the work doesn't exist in a vacuum. The words hung between them like a match waiting to be struck. Brad exhaled through his nose, a sound almost like a laugh, except it wasn't funny. That's a dangerous way to frame art, he said. If we start demanding moral perfection before we allow someone to create, we'll be left with silence. A murmur rippled through the crowd. One of the hosts shifted in her seat, glancing between Sunny and Brad as if silently asking whether this was still part of the plan. Sunny leaned forward now. No one is asking for perfection, she said. But people are asking for honesty. Brad turned to face her fully for the first time. The smile was gone. Honesty, he repeated. Or spectacle? The studio froze. Sunny's eyebrows lifted. Are you suggesting this conversation is spectacle? Brad paused. In that pause, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Cameras zoomed in. Producers stiffened behind the monitors. This was no longer an interview. It was a standoff. I'm suggesting, Brad said slowly, that there's a difference between meaningful dialogue and public interrogation. Sunny didn't retreat. And I'm suggesting that avoiding questions doesn't make them disappear. The applause that followed was scattered, uncertain. Some clapped. Some didn't. The divide was visible now, cutting through the audience like a fault line. Brad's hands tightened together in his lap. You know, he said, his voice dropping, I've spent years doing the work. Therapy. Sobriety. Reflection. Things that don't make headlines. Sunny nodded. And that matters. But so does acknowledging harm. That word, harm, landed hard. Brad leaned forward now, mirroring her posture. You're assuming intent, he said. You're assuming context you don't have. Sunny met his gaze without flinching. I'm acknowledging voices that felt unheard. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Brad stared at her, searching for something, understanding perhaps. Or maybe just an exit. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, but sharper. I don't owe the world my pain, he said. And I won't perform remorse on cue. A gasp escaped somewhere in the audience. One of the hosts tried to interject, but Sunny raised a hand, her eyes never leaving Brad. No one is asking you to perform, she said quietly. But when you benefit from public admiration, public scrutiny comes with it. Brad shook his head slowly. That's a convenient rule, he said. Especially when it only applies one way. Now the energy had shifted completely. This wasn't about a film anymore. This was about power. About narrative. About who gets to ask the questions. And who gets to decide when the conversation ends. Brad straightened in his chair. If this is what the show has become, he said, gesturing vaguely around him, then maybe it's not a space for real conversation. Sunny's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath it now. Real conversation gets uncomfortable. Brad smiled again, but this time it was cold. So does ambush. The audience reacted instantly. Some clapped loudly. Others sat in stunned silence. Social media feeds began to light up in real time. Producers' phones buzzing in their pockets as clips were already being cut, captions already being written. Sunny inhaled, then exhaled. I think, she said carefully, that discomfort is the price of truth. Brad stood. The movement was sudden enough to send a shock through the room. Chairs creaked. Gasps followed. For a split second, no one knew whether he was leaving or just adjusting himself. He looked down at Sunny. And I think, he said, truth doesn't belong to a soundbite. The tension was no longer simmering. It was boiling. If this hits the tone and intensity you want, say, continue with part 2, and I'll deliver the next 2,000-word segment, where the exchange escalates, the hosts divide, and Brad crosses a line no one expected. The moment Brad Pitt stood, the studio stopped breathing. For a heartbeat, maybe two, it felt like he might actually walk off. Cameras tightened their focus, red tally lights glowing like warning signals. A producer's hand hovered just out of frame, half-raised, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment burn. Sunny Hostin remained seated, her hands folded neatly on the table, but her spine was straight, alert, ready. This wasn't panic on her face. It was resolve. Brad didn't leave. Instead, he sat back down, slower this time, deliberately. The chair scraped softly against the floor, a sound that somehow felt louder than applause ever could. He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together as if holding something fragile and dangerous at the same time. You want honesty? He said, his voice quieter now, but far more intense. Then let's talk about honesty. The audience leaned in as one. Even the hosts who usually filled silences with nervous chatter stayed still. This was no longer live television as usual. This was a line being crossed in real time. Sunny nodded once. I'm listening. Brad looked at her for a long second, studying her face as though weighing whether she was an adversary or a mirror. Public conversations like this, he continued, flatten complex lives into headlines. They turn growth into suspicion and regret into entertainment. Sunny didn't interrupt. That alone felt unusual. But, Brad added, lifting his gaze to the audience, the same system that builds you up is eager to tear you down the moment your humanity gets inconvenient. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others frowned. Sunny finally spoke. You're right about one thing. The system is flawed. But power changes how those flaws land. Brad's eyes narrowed. Power, he repeated. Or visibility? Sunny turned slightly toward him, her tone measured but firm. Visibility is power, Brad. Especially when your story gets amplified and others get silenced. That word again. Silenced. Brad laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. You think I've never felt silenced? He asked. You think shame doesn't close mouths? You think fear doesn't erase voices? The audience shifted again. This time, the discomfort was deeper. Sunny's brow furrowed. I'm not questioning your pain, she said. I'm questioning the imbalance. Brad straightened, his voice rising just a notch. And I'm questioning why that imbalance always seems to get resolved on television. A beat. Sunny's lips pressed together briefly before she replied. Because television is where conversations reach people who were never invited into private rooms. The applause that followed was louder this time. Confident. Divided. Brad nodded slowly, absorbing it. Then let me invite you into something, he said. Off-camera conversations. Accountability without performance. Healing without an audience. Sunny met his gaze. That sounds ideal, she said. But ideal isn't always accessible to the people affected. Brad's jaw tightened. So what is this? He asked, gesturing between them. Justice. Or optics. That did it. The air in the studio shifted sharply, like a storm breaking open. One of the co-hosts inhaled audibly, glancing towards Sunny as if silently urging caution. But Sunny didn't retreat. This, she said evenly, is accountability in public spaces where power has historically hidden. Brad shook his head. You're framing me as a symbol, he said. I'm a person. And people, Sunny replied, exist within systems. Brad's voice sharpened. So do hosts. The audience gasped. That wasn't abstract anymore. That was personal. Sunny's eyes flickered, just briefly, but she held her ground. If you're suggesting bias, she said, say it. Brad didn't hesitate. I think there's an expectation, he said, that certain stories are only valid when they're told a certain way. The silence was immediate and heavy. Sunny leaned forward now, her voice lower. Are you saying your story has been misrepresented? Brad met her stare. I'm saying it's been reduced. A pause stretched between them, taut and dangerous. Sunny exhaled. Reduction happens when clarity is avoided. Brad's hands opened, palms up. Or when nuance isn't allowed. The audience erupted into overlapping reactions, applause, murmurs, scattered boos. Producers were no longer pretending this was under control. Phones buzzed continuously behind the cameras. Clips were already trending. Captions were being written faster than the conversation could keep up. Sunny raised her voice just enough to cut through the noise. Brad, people watching right now are not dissecting nuance. They're asking whether accountability matters more than comfort. Brad leaned back, running a hand through his hair. And I'm asking whether public reckoning has become a substitute for real change. Sunny paused, considering him. Sometimes, she said, it's the beginning of it. Brad looked away, his gaze drifting toward the audience, then the ceiling lights. For a moment, the anger softened into something else. Fatigue. Maybe even sadness. You know what no one ever shows, he said quietly. The parts where you sit alone with what you've done. The nights you replay conversations you can't fix. The apologies you'll never be allowed to make because the story's already been written. The room stilled again. Even Sunny seemed to soften just a fraction. But, Brad continued, his voice tightening once more, that doesn't mean I'll accept being turned into a lesson plan. Sunny straightened. No one is turning you into a lesson, she said. But people learn from what we confront. Brad's eyes flashed. At whose expense? The question hung there unanswered. Sunny opened her mouth, then closed it, choosing her words carefully. At the expense of comfort, she said finally. Especially for those who've had the most of it. The applause this time was strong, confident, unmistakable. Brad nodded, lips pressed thin. Then let me be clear, he said. I won't apologize on demand. I won't narrate my healing for approval. And I won't accept a narrative that erases the work I've done just because it doesn't fit a segment. Sunny held his gaze. And I won't pretend that silence feels like accountability to the people watching. Brad leaned forward again, close now, his voice firm. Then maybe, he said, we're not actually talking to each other. A hush fell over the studio. Sunny's voice was calm but resolute. Or maybe, she replied, we're finally saying the quiet parts out loud. The camera cut briefly to the audience. Faces tense, eyes wide, phones discreetly raised despite warnings. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a cultural flashpoint unfolding live. Brad sat back slowly. I came here to talk about art, he said. Instead, I'm being asked to defend my humanity. Sunny met him with unwavering composure. Humanity, she said, is exactly what this conversation is about. The silence afterward felt almost sacred. No one rushed to fill it. No one dared to interrupt. Because everyone could feel it now. This wasn't ending anytime soon. And the next thing Brad said would change everything. Brad didn't speak right away. He sat there, still and upright, his eyes fixed somewhere just past Sunny Hostin, as if the answer to everything hovering between them might be written on the studio wall. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. It wasn't the awkward kind that begged for filler. It was the kind that made people uneasy because it felt intentional. Sunny waited. The audience waited. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, holding their breath as if they, too, understood that whatever came next would not be easily walked back. When Brad finally spoke, his voice was lower than before. Not softer. Lower. Controlled. You keep using the word humanity, he said. So let's be honest about whose humanity gets protected. A murmur rolled through the audience. Sunny's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly against the table. Go on, she said. Brad turned his body fully toward her now. When a man admits fault quietly, does the work privately, and changes his life without spectacle, he's told it's not enough. But if he performs remorse publicly, he's accused of manipulation. Sunny tilted her head. You're describing public skepticism. I'm describing a trap, Brad replied. One where the goalposts keep moving. The co-hosts exchanged glances. One of them shifted forward as if preparing to step in, then stopped herself. This was far beyond moderation now. Sunny inhaled slowly. Skepticism exists because history exists, she said. Because powerful men have apologized before and repeated harm afterward. Brad's jaw clenched. So I'm paying for a pattern I didn't create? Sunny met his gaze. You're part of it. The words landed like a slap. A sharp intake of breath rippled across the studio. Brad blinked once, then let out a short, humorless laugh. That's convenient, he said. Reduce the individual, preserve the narrative. Sunny leaned forward. That's not reduction, she said. That's responsibility. Brad's voice rose slightly, emotion breaking through the restraint. Responsibility to whom? He asked. The internet? The commentators? Or the people who already decided who I am? Sunny's response was immediate. To the people who felt hurt and unheard. Brad shook his head. You keep speaking for them, he said. Have you asked them what they want? The tension spiked again, sharper this time. Sunny's eyes narrowed just enough to be noticeable. Are you suggesting I'm exploiting their pain? Brad didn't answer right away. He looked out at the audience again, scanning faces, some sympathetic, some critical, some frozen somewhere in between. I'm suggesting, he said carefully, that pain becomes currency when it's televised. The audience reacted instantly, some applauded, others groaned. The divide was no longer subtle. Sunny straightened in her chair. Pain becomes currency when it's ignored, she shot back. When people have to scream to be acknowledged. Brad leaned back, hands spread wide. And screaming on TV fixes that? Sunny's voice sharpened. Visibility creates pressure. Pressure creates change. Brad's eyes flashed. Or resentment. The room crackled with energy. One of the co-hosts finally tried to interject, her voice tentative. Maybe we can. Sunny raised a hand without looking away from Brad. I want to understand something, she said. What would accountability look like to you? Brad considered the question. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually answer it thoughtfully. His shoulders dropped slightly. His voice softened. Accountability, he said, looks like change that lasts when no one is watching. Sunny nodded. And how do people know that change has happened? Brad's lips pressed together. They don't, he said. Not always. Sunny seized on that. That uncertainty is exactly why public conversations matter. Brad's tone hardened again. So trust doesn't matter? Sunny replied calmly. Trust is rebuilt, not assumed. Brad leaned forward, frustration evident now. You're asking for proof that can only exist in private, he said. And then condemning the privacy. Sunny didn't hesitate. I'm asking for acknowledgement. Brad's voice rose. Acknowledgement of what, Sunny? A version of events you weren't there for. That was it. The studio erupted, gasps, applause, audible discomfort. The co-hosts shifted again, one of them whispering something urgently under her breath. This was no longer just uncomfortable. It was combustible. Sunny's composure finally cracked just slightly. This isn't about me being there, she said. It's about patterns of harm that repeat because silence protects them. Brad stood up again. This time, there was no ambiguity. Chairs scraped loudly. The movement sent a jolt through the studio. Producers were visibly panicking now, one of them mouthing words toward the control booth. The camera stayed on Brad, tall and rigid, his face flushed but his eyes clear. You don't get to turn me into a stand-in, he said, his voice firm, cutting through the noise. I won't carry the weight of every man who failed. Sunny stood too. The audience gasped louder this time. Two figures now, facing each other across the table, both unyielding. And you don't get to separate yourself from the system that elevated you, Sunny replied. Not when that system harmed others. Brad laughed sharply. So guilt by association? Sunny stepped closer to the table. No, she said. Responsibility by participation. The air felt electric, vibrating with emotion. Brad ran a hand through his hair, pacing a half step before stopping himself. This, he said, gesturing between them, is exactly what I mean. There's no room for complexity here. Only confession or condemnation. Sunny's voice was unwavering. Complexity doesn't erase impact. Brad's eyes darkened. And impact doesn't define intent. They stood there, locked in a stare that felt almost intimate in its intensity. The audience was silent now, completely still, as if afraid to disrupt the moment. Sunny spoke again, quieter but no less firm. Intent doesn't comfort people who were hurt. Brad answered, just as quietly. And public punishment doesn't heal them. A long pause followed. One so deep it felt like time itself had slowed. Finally, Sunny exhaled. Then what does? She asked. Brad looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time since the exchange began, something in his expression shifted. The anger gave way to something rawer. I don't know, he admitted. The admission stunned the room. But I do know, he continued, that reducing lives to moments and moments to headlines won't get us there. Sunny studied him, her expression conflicted. And I know, she replied, that silence has never been neutral. The audience broke into applause again, louder than before, layered with tension and emotion. This wasn't support for one side or the other anymore. It was recognition of something bigger. Brad slowly sat back down. Sunny followed a moment later. They both remained standing in their truths, even as their bodies returned to their seats. But the damage, or the revelation, had already been done. Because now, the conversation wasn't just between them. It belonged to everyone watching. And the fallout was only beginning. The applause didn't fade so much as fracture. It came in waves, some loud and resolute, others hesitant, scattered, almost confused. A few people clapped simply because they didn't know what else to do. The sound filled the studio, but it didn't dissolve the tension. If anything, it sealed it in, trapping everything that had just been said inside the walls like smoke after a fire. Brad Pitt sat back in his chair, shoulders rising and falling with a slow, controlled breath. The adrenaline hadn't left him yet. You could see it in the way his fingers flexed against his knees, in the tight line of his mouth. Across from him, Sunny Hostin adjusted her posture, smoothing the front of her blazer with deliberate calm. She looked composed, but not untouched. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then one of the co-hosts tried to bring the room back from the edge, her voice careful, almost reverent. I think what we're seeing here is how complicated these conversations really are. It sounded rehearsed. Protective. Too late. The audience was no longer fully with the show. They were with the moment. Brad nodded faintly, not looking at her. Complicated doesn't mean careless, he said, his voice steadier now, but still edged with emotion. Sunny turned toward the co-host, then back to Brad. And careful doesn't mean quiet, she replied. There it was again. The impasse. Two truths standing side by side, neither willing to bow. The director finally made the call. The screen cut to commercial. But the damage and the impact had already escaped the studio. Backstage, the energy was frantic. Producers spoke in low, urgent tones. Phones were everywhere now, screens glowing with notifications stacking faster than anyone could read them. Clips of the exchange were already spreading across social platforms, stripped of context, sharpened into weapons. Captions screamed in all caps. Hashtags formed in real time. Brad stood, this time without drama, and thanked the hosts politely. The words sounded automatic, but his eyes were distant. Sunny returned the courtesy, her expression professional, but her jaw tight. They didn't speak privately. They didn't need to. The conversation had outgrown them. Within minutes, the internet split cleanly down the middle. Some hailed Brad as brave, finally pushing back against what they called performative accountability. They praised his refusal to be cornered, his insistence on privacy, his raw admission that healing doesn't always translate to spectacle. Clips of his sharpest lines were shared with captions calling him measured, honest, human. Others rallied behind Sunny. They called her fearless, necessary, unflinching. They applauded her refusal to let power hide behind nuance, her insistence that visibility comes with responsibility. Her words about silence and systems were quoted endlessly, turned into graphics, reposted with fire emojis and raised fists. And then there were those who felt unsettled by both. Those who watched the exchange and didn't see a winner, only a collision. Two realities crashing into each other on live television, exposing how fragile the language of accountability really is when it's forced into a segment. Media outlets rushed to frame it. Some called it an explosive on-air clash. Others labeled it a long overdue reckoning. A few described it as deeply uncomfortable but necessary. No one agreed on what it meant. Talk shows dissected it. Podcasts devoted entire episodes to it. Psychologists weighed in. Cultural critics argued about whether Brad had been defensive or honest, whether Sunny had been courageous or confrontational. Every sentence was pulled apart, examined, judged. Brad released a short statement 2 days later. It was carefully worded, calm, restrained. He reiterated his commitment to growth, acknowledged the importance of difficult conversations, and emphasized that healing often happens away from cameras. Supporters praised its dignity. Critics called it insufficient. Sunny addressed the moment on her own terms the following week. She spoke about the responsibility of public platforms, about asking hard questions even when it costs comfort. She didn't apologize. She didn't gloat. She stood by her words. The audience reaction never fully settled. And maybe that was the point. Because what lingered wasn't just the argument, it was the discomfort. The way the exchange forced viewers to confront their own expectations. Do we want accountability to be visible, or do we want it to be sincere? Do we demand access to other people's growth, or do we accept that some changes happen quietly, without proof? Brad Pitt returned to his work, but interviews grew more cautious. There was a new edge to the questions, a new awareness that he might push back again. Sunny Hostin continued her role, undeterred, her reputation sharpened rather than softened by the clash. She became, for many, a symbol of refusing to yield, even when the guest was a Hollywood icon. The View moved on to the next episode, the next guest, the next debate. But that moment never fully faded, because it wasn't just television. It was a mirror, and everyone who watched saw something different reflected back at them. So now the conversation shifts to you. When you watched or heard about this explosive exchange, who did you side with? Brad insisting that growth doesn't owe anyone a performance? Or Sunny standing firm that power must answer publicly when harm enters the conversation? Or did you find yourself somewhere in the uneasy middle, unsettled by how hard it is to hold space for both accountability and humanity at the same time? Let us know what you think. Drop your opinion in the comments. This is one conversation that deserves more than silence. And if you want more cinematic, intense, behind-the-moment storytelling like this, subscribe to The Narration Show. Like the video, share it with someone who loves deep, dramatic media moments, and stay with us, because the next story might be even more explosive.